Okay, I think that we are alive.
Right.
Okay, so welcome everyone to this new series of the FAP-SIG. We are trying to check on researchers around the world, and we are really honored that our first speaker is going to be Jonathan Cantor, who is going to be and is working a lot on FAP along all these years. So thank you, Jonathan, for being here and sharing all your knowledge in research and your thoughts about the future on the research on FAP.
Thank you, Amanda. And hi, everybody. This is fun to do this new format. And yeah, I'm excited to be here. So I appreciate it also.
Okay, so we are ready for you. When you are ready, please just share us your slides.
So I have some slides to share, and I'll walk through some of the big ideas I wanted to describe to everybody. I also want to apologize. I have a bit of a cold, so you may hear me cough once or twice. I can tell you it's not COVID. I got my negative test result yesterday, so just a cold. This is score one for the common cold.
That's good.
So apologize if you hear me cough. And Amanda, since this is a new format, I just want to invite you, if at any point, I know you've been doing an incredible amount of FAP research too, you have a lot to say. So if there's any point you want to just ask me a question or interrupt or add something, I certainly invite you to do that with me. But for now, I'll start by sharing my screen. And I wanted to just start by giving everybody my sense of the history of FAP, and then I'll talk very broadly about research and what I and my colleagues have been trying to do and where I think things are going in the future. But I wanted to start with the history, and I'm going way back to this word reinforcement, which I know many people in the community are already familiar with, but I thought it would be useful to start at the beginning and go through this pretty briefly. So here's my favorite slide to describe reinforcement. And of course, as many of you know, this is, in my opinion, the basis of FAP. You evoke a behavior. You can do this in a variety of ways. It's happening right now as I'm speaking. Sort of passive behavior I'm evoking in all of you, perhaps just listening, but nonetheless, I'm evoking behavior, and then I get some behavior in response. And then, of course, the idea is what happens after the behavior, and hopefully some reinforcing response happens. This, right, is the basic three-term contingency. You evoke a behavior, you get the behavior, you reinforce the behavior. And when this happens over and over again, multiple times, well then, the basic principle of behavior analysis, of functional analysis, is that you then start to see more and more of that behavior in other contexts, in other settings. This is it. That was kind of the meaning of life to early behavior analysts, right? We built entire models of treatment for kids with behavioral disorders, for training around this very basic principle. So apply this to FAP, right? Here's the early book by Bob and Mavis in 1991. And here's my favorite slide describing what I think FAP does. And in my opinion, this early book was really an application of that basic principle that I just described to adult outpatient psychotherapy. So here on the left is my depiction of a therapist and a client. And the idea of FAP is that same thing happens in therapy, right? And those of us know that the behaviors of interest in therapy, we call CRBs. CRB1s are the problems, CRB2s are the improvements, right? The same thing happens in therapy. The therapist does this sensitively, genuinely, authentically, lovingly with the client, and then notices more of the good behavior in therapy. And I would say because of the nature of the therapy relationship, the nature of FAP and the people involved, we were particularly interested in the kinds of behaviors that would increase intimacy, closeness, and connection. Although the model could really be applied to anything, right? We know that. But this was sort of what was supposed to happen, at least most of the time, in FAP therapy. And of course, the big idea is that this was supposed to produce improvements in the client's outside life. If this worked in therapy, we reinforce the behavior in therapy, we should also see more of similar behaviors in the client's outside life. And to the degree that these were the relevant behaviors, a corresponding increase in intimacy, closeness, and connection. This is kind of the meaning of life, from my perspective, of early FAP. This is how it was designed. Research followed suit. And early research on FAP, as many of you know, really took that microscopic analysis of the process seriously. As we know in FAP, we would call evoking the behavior Rule 2. I'm assuming you all know the rules of FAP, but when you did this in FAP, evoking the behavior was Rule 2. If you're thinking about how this plays out in session, you would typically observe CRB1s. We'll call that observing behavior Rule 1 in FAP. When you observe the CRB1, well, let's keep trying because we don't want a CRB1, right? We want a CRB2, so we'll re-evoke. We may see more CRB1, we'll re-evoke again. We may see more CRB1. What we want, of course, is to see the improvement. When we, through Rule 1, notice the improvement, and we're done evoking, and now we want to apply some reinforcement. That's Rule 3 in FAP, right? And in good FAP sessions, as many of you know, this can hopefully become a positive spiral. You reinforce the improvement, you get more improvement, you reinforce it again, and this can actually be experienced as very intimate and loving when this process occurs. So that's the whole model, right? And then afterwards, we do Rule 4, assess your attempts at reinforcement, and Rule 5. Early FAP research really tried to explore this model microscopically. We can call it microprocess research. I was involved in some of that research. I'm not sure who's listening right now, but I know Amanda did some of this research and her students. Many of you may have done this over the years. Just one example of what it looked like. This is a long time ago. We would ask our clients to record their behaviors with diary cards, outside session behaviors with diary cards. There's a study in which we were recording the problem behavior. And so once we initiated FAP with this client we're calling Melissa, we saw a decrease in the outside problem behavior, very consistent and clear decrease as soon as we started FAP in this behavior. And we could look at what happened in session. This is the microprocess analysis. And I'm not going to get into the details here. I'm just giving you a little sample of what we did. These are lag sequential analyses showing that when here in the FAP part of the therapy, when the therapist observed a CRB1, or actually when raters looking at the therapy tapes observed a CRB1, what did the therapist do afterwards? Did they evoke properly? Did they respond properly to the CRB1? Well, they did a lot of the time here. And same with CRB2s. When we observed CRB2s in therapy, did the therapist respond effectively? And yes. So this is evidence that the mechanism of FAP, when you see an outcome like this, the mechanism of FAP seems to have occurred. But of course, there's all sorts of gaps and problems with this. It's not complete, but at least it's supportive evidence. So I'm not going to go too much more into that history. Just there were lots of studies like this, microprocess studies, several decades of research actually. And then, as many of you know, more recently, we have this new book. Notice the title now has the words awareness, courage, and love on it, 2009, right? So things shifted, as many of you know. Here's how I look at the shift. If you compare the early book to the old book, well, that was wrong. If you compare the early book to the later book, you will notice that this setup I have here in the new book was often described in terms of awareness, courage, and love, with Rule 1, observing, sort of being described as an awareness issue, Rule 2, courage, being described as a courage issue, and Rule 3, reinforcement, being described as a love issue. For me personally, this made a lot of sense. I like the translation of these technical terms into terms that I could connect with as a human being. Other people I think responded to it favorably as well. There are many ways to describe awareness, for example. These are just some examples of how we described awareness. There are many different ways to get at the idea of courage. What does it take to evoke behavior as a therapist? These are just some of those words. And of course, there are many ways to describe love. What does it take to really authentically, genuinely, naturally reinforce the behavior? And these are just some words that got at it. While this was a change in our language that many people responded to, I have to admit it made the research more difficult, and I had lots of difficult conversations with my research colleagues about what to do as scientists, as researchers, with this change in the language, with this move to middle level terms. And I know Amanda has a lot to say about this as well, as I'm sure many of you do. I will say, for me personally, I took this as a challenge. I wanted to stay a solid scientist, and I wanted to use these terms. And I wanted to see if I could bring these terms into the mainstream science. This was my personal mission for a while. So it looked like this. This is what I was hoping to do as a researcher and a scientist. And this is now a version of a slide that I first started sharing about 12 years ago. So we start with this new model, this middle level term model, if we can call it that. It was really just a clinical model that primarily Mavis had been using. And it was originally a clinical model for what the therapist should do in session. I, and not just me, but many others, including Mavis, wanted to take this model and see if it could work as a model for what the client should and can do in his or her, their life. In other words, a model of clinical outcomes, not just of therapist behavior. I wanted to make sure that as we were talking about this model, it comported with the science and it was informed by the science. And I spent years trying to work this out, arguing with people, debating people, often losing those arguments and debates, but persisting in trying to build what I thought was a solid scientific theoretical model for why awareness, courage, and love mattered. Not just clinically, but scientifically. That was my challenge. I wanted this theoretical model to inform what I was calling both basic and applied research on FAP. What do I mean by that? Basic research, I wanted measures. I wanted to develop measures such that we could measure when awareness, courage, and love were changing. We could measure when therapists were engaging in awareness, courage, and love in session, and we could measure when clients were changing with respect to skill at these behaviors. I'm not sure if you want to call them behaviors, but I think you get the idea. I also wanted to do experimental research, and I wasn't the only one, but I'll share some of this with you all in a second, to really explore at the basic experimental level, does this awareness, courage, love model matter? Can we show that it matters scientifically? And then, of course, what most of us care about, all the applied research. How do we apply this and make a difference in human lives? So the original and biggest application was psychotherapy. And as far as psychotherapy is concerned, we wanted to look at clinical outcomes of FAP therapists using this model to guide their own behavior and as a model of understanding the client. I'll talk about that in a second. As I said earlier, was very interested in that microprocess research. I wanted to continue that. I didn't really continue it. It was hard to continue it with this model, but we could talk about that. And then, as many of you know, and then I also wanted to do training research. Can we train therapists? And can we show that we can train therapists in this model? And then, as I'm assuming many of you know, excuse me, that's the cough I warned you about. Many of us were interested in what 12 years ago we were calling FAP for the public. I don't think we use that term anymore. At the time when I originally developed this slide, I was in close conversation with Gareth Holman, who was very interested at the time in applying ideas like this to business consulting and to helping organizations and workforces connect and succeed by bringing awareness, courage, and love into the organization. I don't want to speak for Gareth, but that's my understanding of the idea at the time. What we now, I think, are calling Live with ACL or Living with ACL. At the time, the early name for it was Intimacy Now. This was what Mavis was calling it back then. And I was also in contact with Mavis, and I was imagining these sort of three arms of FAP for the public: one for businesses, one for what we now call Living with ACL, just for the masses, I guess you would say. And then I was very interested in applying this model in the space of anti-racism. I was doing a lot of this work over the years as well, which I won't get into today too much. So these were sort of the three arms of application. I think there were others that were developed, but this was really the big research picture that was driving me and that I was interested in disseminating to others, like all these things we can do with this model, and let's be thoughtful and systematic about it. So I want to make sure there's time for Amanda and me to interact and discuss this. So what I wanted to do now for just a few minutes, and then I'll turn back to Amanda and see if we can just discuss, is just share a couple of publications in a couple of these different domains and tell you all about sort of where progress is and where the future is going. And so I'm going to switch off this slide and just share some publications now, but remember these terms on this slide because I think it'll be helpful as we go through a couple of these publications. So first, measure development. So let me see if I can switch now, and this might be a little awkward with Zoom, but I'll be able to do this if you're all just patient with me for a second. Okay, new share. Wait 1 second, everybody. Here we go. Okay. So that first piece of the puzzle, just the theoretical model of awareness, courage, and love, why does this matter? I personally felt that was item number one on the agenda. We had to tie awareness, courage, and love to the large, voluminous literature on relationship functioning, almost 100 years of literature on relationships from, honestly, not so much clinical psychology, which is what my degree is in, but most of this literature is actually from social psychology or social cognitive psychology. And as such, we had to do a lot of translating of terms from social cognitive language to contextual behavioral language. This was a project that myself and many colleagues spent many years on. We eventually published this model in 2020. And for me, this was a big deal. This is my manifesto, quite honestly, where we really walk through what we think is a contextually, behaviorally consistent, scientifically informed way of understanding what was originally awareness, courage, and love. Although in this model, it got elaborated based on the science that we were observing. And I won't go through the whole paper right now, but I just want to say that to me, this was really, really the guiding force. I'm just going to scroll down to this one figure here. Oh, I might have missed the figure. Where's the figure? All right, forget the figure. You can look it up yourselves. That, if you remember the earlier slide, the theoretical model of ACL, why it matters. We spent years on it. Here's the paper where we describe it. Measure development. This is also a multi-year process that my student and soon-to-be intern at UW Psychiatry, Adam Kaczynski, worked on. We call it the Awareness, Courage, and Responsiveness Scale. Yeah, we changed the word love to the word responsiveness. You can debate me about that. If you look at the social psychology literature, if you look at that earlier paper that I just referred to, the social psychology literature uses the term responsiveness. That's the term in the literature. I think there's a functional parallel between what we as FAP therapists mean by love and what social cognitive psychologists mean by responsiveness. Anyway, we chose the more scientific term for this scale. That scale is now available. I think Adam and I would both agree that the scale is good. but from a psychometric standpoint, not great. And that's a problem. To the extent that we want to use this scale to measure outcomes, like do a FAP study, does the client change with respect to being more aware, more courageous, more loving in relationships? We want to be able to measure that change. We think the scale does a good but not great job at that. More work, in my opinion, is needed here. But I think this is valid enough to be usable, but there's always more work to do. Anyway, this is the measure development piece. I mentioned next, if you remember that earlier slide, in that basic science category, experimental research. This idea of awareness, courage, and love, can we use it as a way of just exploring relational interactions experimentally? So the first study we did on this is by my previous student, Kevin Hayworth. And then you can see some familiar names on there as well. And basically what we did in this study is we brought undergraduates into our lab. We had them interact with a trained undergraduate, and they just had intimate interactions with each other. We used, if you know it, what are called the 36 questions. And we showed in this study that if somebody engages in an act of courage, in an act of vulnerability, if the other person doesn't respond with love, respond with responsiveness, you're not going to get an increase in the courage behavior. We basically showed that, what we titled it here, have reinforcement, responsiveness, love, sort of we're moving from the technical term to the less technical term. It matters. That's a good thing. That's the heart of FAP. Reinforcement matters. So this was the first study to show this experimentally. We thought that was important. A long story short, several years later, through various twists and turns, which I won't have time to get into, we were now focused on fear of intimacy in particular. We focused on fear of intimacy because of results that we found in some research, and also because of some really important results that Daniel Maitland found in his dissertation. And I know Daniel has also done some really important research and is probably, in my opinion, the leading researcher in this area right now. We were interested in doing that same study that I just described earlier, Kevin's study, but now only for people who are reporting they're scared of intimacy. These are more likely the people who are going to show up in therapy, right? So does that same process apply for people who are really high in fear of intimacy? Well, the short answer is yes, it applies. The same process applies. The longer answer is it's complicated. There are some differences, which I could get into if you want, but I'm trying to keep it at a broad level now. But this study, some other studies, led us to think that when we're thinking about clinical applications of FAP using this ACL model, people with high fear of intimacy are a really good target. They're an important problem. There are a lot of them, and this model applies pretty well to them in particular. So those are, whoops, I have to just move the screen here so I can get to my next. Okay, good. So those are some examples of the work that we were doing. If you remember that earlier slide, in the basic category, it was measure development and it was experimental research. I'm going to switch now to the applied domain, which we really want. How are we actually impacting human lives, and are we making human lives better? This was the first study that we did on this topic. This was, you could call it sort of an early version. I don't know if Mavis would agree. I would let her speak up on this. But my sense of it is, this was sort of an early version of what is now living with ACL. We did this with couples. It didn't have to be romantic couples. It could have been friends. It could have been a parent and an adult child. Any two people who wanted to improve their relationship. we brought them in to a 4-session ACL intervention led by a trained coach. Mavis trained these coaches. And it was a randomized trial. And to make a long story short, what we found in this trial is that it worked, but it only worked and maintained improvements for people with high fear of intimacy. It didn't work as well for people who didn't have high fear of intimacy. And if you think about it, well, that kind of makes sense, because people who aren't scared of intimacy, well, they're already doing pretty well in relationships. So we wanted to sort of identify who are the people in clinical need here. And this was one bit of evidence for A, that this version of the model works, and B, well, it works particularly well for people with high fear of intimacy. So what's next here? I'm almost done. Oh, okay. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a second and just look at y'all, and then I'll share my screen for a few more minutes, and then I'll stop. All of these ideas were percolating in my lab with me and my graduate students and others, talking with various colleagues, with Bob and Mavis, and wanting to develop and test this model with a good sized randomized clinical trial. We spent years developing this, debating this, arguing with each other about the right way to do it. Quite honestly, it was a much longer process than any of us had intended. We finally got the project started at the beginning of, at the end of 2019. And we had run about 20 or so people through the project. I can't remember the actual number. I think it was 24 people through the study. And then March 2020 hit, and the pandemic came, and we had to stop the study. This was a blow, I'm sure, to many of you and your work as well. It was a big blow to our work because we had just started the study. Sarah Sullivan-Singh, an amazing FAP therapist and contextual behavioral therapist broadly defined here in Seattle, was my close collaborator on this and the development of this. And we had a bunch of therapists trained, and it was sort of brutal that we had to stop this study just when it started. I haven't restarted the study. If any of you are listening and are interested in our manual and in the details of the study, we actually, let me see if I can share this with you all right now. I think I can. I think, sorry, thank you for your patience with me. I can't find the manual right now, but we have a manual that we were training the therapists in to do this study. It's about 120 pages, single spaced. It's basically a book. We wrote a book on how to do FAP from the perspective of this theoretical model of ACL that we had developed. It's an 8-session treatment. It's meant for people with high fear of intimacy. I'm very proud of this manual. I don't know if it works because we stopped our trial. What we did instead, and I really have to credit my student, Adam Kaczynski, for noticing that this COVID crisis was coming and saying to me, Jonathan, we need to do something about COVID. We're studying relationships, we're studying social connection. COVID's going to impact all that. Adam was honestly somewhat heroic during this time, just how he pivoted himself, he pivoted his work, and he pivoted actually the whole lab. One of the things we ended up doing is developing this study, which came out last year. It took us months. We developed a very brief set of 5 or 10-minute mini lessons using the ACL model to help people stay connected and improve their relationships during the COVID crisis. We got about 1,000 people in this study. We did the whole thing over text. Let me see. Let's see, what does it say here? Here we go. Here's the abstract. Yeah, we had the intervention had 700 people in it, 720 people, and then a group that just got the assessment had 700 people in it. Every morning for 1 month, we sent the intervention people over text a little mini lesson on the ACL model, and we asked them to do it. Some of them did it, some of them didn't. And we looked at results with respect to loneliness and depression in particular. And I'll just scroll down to one of our results and I'll share it with you. No, that's a lot. Here we come. All right. This is our result for depressed mood and loneliness. And I guess you can also see relationship quality. It's a bit of a hard to follow this graph, but basically what we see here, this is relationship quality. And this is the difference between the people who got the intervention and the assessment only people. And this is how long, this is over the course of these 28 days. And what you can see is that people's relationship quality was improving the more they stayed in the study. And then, I apologize, it was 3 weeks, 21 days. And then after the third week was up, we had 1 week of follow-up where they weren't getting the text messages anymore. And you can see that immediately they stop improving. Same thing with this middle graph here is loneliness. Whoops, there's loneliness. This top graph here is depression. Improvements occur, and then as soon as we stopped giving them the texts, improvements stopped. What does that mean? It means we can't stop giving them the texts. 3 weeks wasn't long enough. That's what we concluded in this study. Good intervention, but we needed it to be stronger and longer. We're working on that actually right now. Okay, the last thing I'll say to you, and then I'll stop, is if you remember that FAP for the public category, I'm guessing a lot of you, I'm not sure who's listening right now, a lot of you may be involved with living with ACL. That's, I think, Mavis's big effort to bring FAP to the public. I admit I'm not that involved I'm not involved at all with living with ACL. I wish you all well. I hope it succeeds. Mavis and I couldn't really come to agreement on various details and how this was going to play out and how much science was needed beforehand. And I don't want to get into all of it, but I love the idea. I love the project. I'm not involved. I hope it goes really well. What I have been doing instead is the anti-racism stuff. And I'm actually really proud of this, and it's really consumed my life. It started before the pandemic. It started before the murder of George Floyd, but in particular with the pandemic, the murder of George Floyd, the eruption of national protests here in the United States, my life really shifted such that now I'm doing this almost full time, and it's almost all consuming. We did a couple of studies. A long story here. I haven't given you the whole background because some of this is not FAP related, but we did a couple of studies in which we took this ACL model as a major component of an intervention to try to improve interracial interactions. And in particular, we were interested in addressing the phenomenon of racial microaggressions. And we want to decrease microaggressions and improve interracial interactions. This is a study in which we did this in a medical context. So we can show that 5-hour workshop that includes the ACL model, but then it also includes other stuff that's ACT-related, related to racism and microaggressions. And we can actually decrease the likelihood that a white medical provider will microaggress against a Black patient. This study in particular has been what has gotten me really involved in the University of Washington Medical Center, where I'm now doing a lot of work with the Office of Healthcare Equity, training people throughout the system on various ideas related to improving interracial interactions and decreasing microaggressions. There's one other study that we did with my colleague Monica Williams. We applied similar ideas, not in the context of medical interactions. This was the similar theme, similar workshop, but different in some ways, just with college students. In this study, we had, I can't remember the sample size. Let's see, 44 students randomly assigned to either an active group or what, this is Monica's term, the Racial Harmony Workshop. I don't know if that title would fly today in 2022, but Monica liked the title back when we were doing this together. half of the participants were white college students, half of the participants were Black college students. And again, what we found with respect to the white college students is that they felt closer and more connected to the Black college students after, and they were less likely to microaggress against Black students. What we found for the Black students is that they also felt closer and more connected, and they also increased their sense of ethnic identity, Black identity, which is an important phenomenon for Black students and with benefits, mental health benefits in a variety of ways. Actually, there's complications there, but we found that the intervention helped both the white students and the Black students. But I will admit, it seemed to have bigger effects for the white students, which is a problem because we want to make sure these interventions help everybody. Okay, so that's kind of my summary. I know it was a very broad overview. I sort of started with the origins of FAP, that old model of reinforcement, microprocess research, the transition to more of a focus on awareness, courage, and love. And then I tried to describe to you all of my efforts to build that into a scientific model, measurement, experimental research, clinical applications, and then what we're calling FAP for the public. I will say it's a pretty big disappointment for me that we started this randomized trial and then stopped it. And now I'm in a position financially and at my university where I don't have enough resources to pick it back up. And I will say, just me personally, I'm very engaged in the work on microaggressions and anti-racism. And I feel that I'm honoring the model by bringing those ideas into that space. And it seems to be reinforcing at the moment, even though it's very difficult actually in a lot of ways that I'm not getting into today. So I think I'll stop there if that's okay, Amanda, and turn it back to you. And I'm not sure what's supposed to happen now, but thanks for giving me the opportunity to give you all this very broad overview. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for your perspective. I think that you've been there for so longer that you can give us a really good perspective of what's been happening for years and your personal challenges and personal loves regarding FAP and encounters regarding FAP and how difficult is sometimes that process. I don't know if we don't have any questions in so far, but I have a couple like thoughts that I would love to discuss with you.
I suspect you do. I would love to hear your thoughts.
When I was listening to you and all this evolution regarding the research on FAP, I was thinking about what are your thoughts about other interpersonal behaviors that are not related with intimacy? Because it seems that this being like narrowed down to an intimacy field, but other kind of interpersonal behaviors are not so like in the table of the research on FAP. So I don't know what you think about these other topics.
Well, the original model from the 1991 book, you know, if you read that book, most of the clinical examples in that book focus on intimacy. If you look at the research on FAP as a clinical treatment, most of the examples that are provided in case studies and clinical studies and in research focus on intimacy. There's actually a review of that very phenomenon by Daniel Maitland and myself, looking at how many of the published FAP cases actually focus on intimacy and ACL. Most do. And at the same time, the model has always intended to be broader than that, right? The basic ideas of FAP should apply to a variety of behaviors in a variety of contexts and not just intimacy. Intimacy, I think, makes the most sense and it's the most logical because the therapy context is an intimate context. And so it's just a natural application because the therapy relationship is an intimate relationship. And so it just makes a lot of sense that intimacy will predominate. But the model, I think, the original FAP model, I think, should and can apply to a variety of contexts and a variety of behaviors. And I know there's a lot of people doing a lot of really interesting work in that regard. So
what do you think that has been a barrier? Like you said, like the first book is pretty much related with intimacy. The second book has the 2009 has a special chapter for intimacy. But what do you think that is been happening, that other interpersonal behaviors that are really challenging? Like I can think about conflict management. A lot of people have problems with that. And
yeah.
I believe that when you touch base with your client doing
Yeah.
FAP and working with conflicts is like, wow, it's a huge change.
So the Awareness, Courage, and Love book was published, I believe, in 2009. And then right on the heels of that book, I think in 2010, my memory of dates is bad, we also published a book called Applications of FAP. And each chapter in that book talked about a different application in a different context and with a different target. And so, and that book is much broader than just intimacy. That was, I think, 2010. So that was 13 years ago. I have to admit, I, and maybe others and you are keeping track with all of the developments and all the ideas that are now out there that are broader than intimacy. So it would be interesting to try to update that kind of diverse applications of FAP. You know, for example, I'm doing it in the space of anti-racism. And I wouldn't say I'm trying to increase intimacy between people, although I am trying to increase authentic and close relationships.
Okay, that's interesting, because like that's a topic that is really challenging for everyone, from the facilitator and from the person that has these behaviors. So how do you deal with all this challenge on, like, people maybe feeling like judged or tackled by what is happening in the session? So I think that is interesting, that word, because not many people are able to get in that kind of labor, because it's too attached to the self, you know, and people don't want to get there. So how is this work? I think that is really interesting, and maybe for the broader audience would be really nice to hear how FAP can do something there.
So for the last 20 or so years, I don't know who's listening right now, but if people are familiar with my involvement in FAP, they may be less familiar with the kind of parallel work I've been doing with respect to anti-racism and microaggressions. I've been doing this for 20 years also. And, you know, I'll say that across that whole time span, right now in 2022, it's never been so difficult to interact across differences. It's never been so fraught with peril. There's never been, in my experience, so much pain and difficulty in this space. And I also think there's, for white people like myself, there's also never been so much connection with the accurate history. There's never been so much accurate understanding of the history and the pain that's involved for Black people, brown people, other people of color, anyone with a minoritized or marginalized identity. So everything is really on edge right now. And there's research to support this. And of course, a lot of it is interacting with politics, right? And politics is almost even harder to talk about right now in 2022 than race. And, you know, you all know this. So it's an incredibly fraught space to do this work. And I also think it's incredibly meaningful, and we need to get more people involved. And I think FAP and ACT, quite honestly, are really amazing vehicles to find our way to do this work authentically, focused on healing and improving relationships, and to address all of the polarization and despair and pain that exists right now. So that's a very broad statement, but
I want to go deeply, because you said, like, for me, haven't been difficult. What is related with that? What made you your approach easier for you? What have you learned in the process that have helped you?
I don't know if I can speak to anything that's made it easier for me. I think I think I have a certain persistence. Maybe it's that sort of intersection of ACT and FAP ideas that is just about acceptance of discomfort, acceptance of difficulty in the service of what we value. I have a certain, personally, I think I have a certain resistance to extinction. Maybe that's not healthy for me, I don't know. But I persist, the values are there. I have a lot of colleagues now. I have a lot of colleagues of color who I work very closely with, who all work together and support each other. And yeah, perhaps that's what I would say now that I think about it. I think you can't do it alone. Yeah, you can't stay in this work alone. And I know that's really important to people who actually have minoritized or marginalized identities doing this work. And I will say it's important for me too, doing this work. So.
And I think that make a lot of sense with FAP. It's about being together and have healthy relationships and interactions and building up a community. And I don't know if that acceptance of the things that we don't know or are uncomfortable, because stepping out and listen to all these histories of pain is not easy, but being able to transpass those barriers for better relationships, it's kind of the game thing.
Yeah, that is that to me that's close to the meaning of life, and I'll be humble about it. You know, we can talk about it now in hopefully these useful and inspirational terms, but on a day-to-day basis, you know, I can be a bit of a disaster just like everybody else. But the big idea, and to me this is close to the meaning of life, is that combination of these core ideas from ACT and FAP. First, it's about acceptance of discomfort, willingness to lean in, identifying our values, and then leaning in the service of those values, and then bringing into that the FAP idea. The value is relationships. The value is community. The value is healing across differences. And then bringing the behaviors and skills of courage and love to all of that. That's the inspiration. That's the vision.
Yeah, I was thinking that like the difference, like cultural difference, for instance, on the States versus, for instance, in Latin America, where we also deal a lot with politics, and how painful is for people the situation, but we don't talk too much about it because it's kind of also a mix in some countries with dangerous, you know, and how to build up those communities of like nurturing, even when we can think different, but our community is more important than our political values or perspectives more than values. So yeah, I was thinking about it.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I think that sounds right. It is extremely difficult. You know, here in the United States, and I know this is occurring at least to some degree in other cultures and countries. You know, here in the United States, especially for people who I sort of identify as progressive or liberal like myself, there's a universe to explore of anti-racism, and that universe has a language and a bunch of concepts that are actually very meaningful and important to a lot of people, but also very far from being defined in contextual behavioral terms. So that there's a gap there that I think a lot of people struggle with. So we're talking about terms, well, like microaggressions, like white supremacy, like let's be blunt about white supremacy and the history, about white fragility, about white privilege. I mean, these are terms that are incredibly important and incredibly polarizing. And in many cases, we lack a way of translating that easily into contextual behavioral terms, such that we know what to do with them as researchers, as clinicians. We find ourselves abandoning contextual behavioral science because these terms are so important to us, and we just sort of take them and we take all the theoretical and conceptual baggage from other systems that doesn't actually help us with intervention. It's very complex in there to take all that seriously and to want to try to keep a contextual behavioral model because we think that's how we can be most effective. It's very tricky.
Yeah, I think that that's a huge challenge that we have in front of us, like this translational research that really capture the complexities of the interactions, especially when the interactions go beyond the individual and start to imply a lot of more individuals, like the community and the groups and the cultural practices, and how we include that also in the clinical context. Because sometimes it feels like, oh yeah, we are here, you and me and anything else, but we are blind of all the cultural practices that are occurring in the session. So
I think there's more and more interest in that, I think, among ACT clinicians and ACT researchers. I hope those who also identify as FAP researchers and FAP clinicians are getting into that. I think there's a lot that we can contribute there to help improve things. And I'm not sure how much of that is happening, but certainly it's important to me and to my colleagues to use our ideas in that space and see if we can help make a difference.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, well, thank you so much for being here, Jonathan. It's been amazing, as always, a privilege. And we hope that you enjoyed the time here too, and that we can continue this work of dissemination on FAP so that people can be more aware of what we are doing.
Well, I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about FAP and talk about my research, and I always appreciate you, Amanda, and I hope this project of yours succeeds. And yeah, I'm excited and proud to have been a part of it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, everyone. Bye.
Right,
We'll see you later.